as you all know, we'll be talking about a lot of different things, but also with folk gods in the center of the conversation. And there's that book. Yeah, Praveen is holding it up for you. So here's how we decided to do it. So in the beginning, we thought Praveen would introduce how the book came about, talk about it, and then he's going to do a reading. And then we're going to go into the discussion. And if you guys have any questions, you can throw it at him here. I'll read them out for you and he will answer them for you. Or yeah, you can also join me as I ask him some of the questions that have been on my mind. So Praveen, do you want to tell us a little bit about how the book came about? Just give us a background there.
It's a long rambling one. Well, if you guys want, you can download the book for free from the Isimode website. The book it's a collection of 10 folk tales that I retold, and it's available in. There are 4 versions of it, each of which has English alongside Nepali, Hindi, Tibetan, and I think Mandarin, Chinese. So you can look that up. So companion kitab, there's another book called Shared Sacred Landscapes, written by Kamala Kapoor and me. So there is a program within Isimode called the Kailas Sacred Landscape Project. They do a lot of, those of you who know about Isimode know that they work mostly on mountain issues, all kinds of things. Like they have 6 different thematic areas, I think. This particular project is trying to get the entire Kailash region declared a World Heritage Site. If it does become a World Heritage Site, it'll be the biggest in the world because of the land area that it occupies, and also because it'll be the first of its kind in that it will occupy areas in 3 different countries. And if you think about it, areas like Kalapani will come, Lipu Lake will come under that area. So there's a whole bunch of contentious border areas between the 3 nations that will actually become part of a World Heritage Site. So in some ways, it'll also work towards mitigating the political conflict by promoting the sacred landscape. So India-China Institute at the New School in New York, where Ashok Gurungdai works, had partnered with Isimode to promote the people's culture, the relationship with the landscape itself, and the place of the sacred within that landscape through artifacts like this, specifically the shared sacred kitab. So there was an expedition of sorts that went to Kailash. I also got to travel along with them. Before
tell
that,
us more about the. I'll just interrupting you.
Sorry.
Tell us more about the journey. Like how long did it take? The traveling.
Can I give first? I'll give credit to the people who written light.
Okay.
Just so that they don't get mad at me later.
Okay, go on.
People like Himani Upadhyay in Uttarakhand, Sheetal Aitwal, Sagar Lamaji, Pasangyang ji in Humla, and Kishang Chimi and Kungala in Tibet. They were assisting the project by collecting these folk tales. So they were traveling through the region, talking to people, collecting stories from them, which then came to Isimode, and Shraddha Ghale, novelist, was supposed to edit them, but then she decided to work on her novel instead. So I got the gig. So the idea was that I would edit the raw material that came in, and then forward the stories to Kamala Kapoor, who is a well-known Indian writer who lives in the US, and she writes mostly about spirituality. So she takes stories from the Puranas or stories like these, and then she has stories about Guru Nanak also. I think the book on Kabir, I'm not quite sure. So she rewrites them in order to bring out the spiritual aspect of those stories. So these field researchers did the collection of these stories, most of them. If you download the books available as PDFs on the EC Mode website, there are credits given to whoever originally told the story, who collected the story, who translated them, and then the reteller like me or Kamalaji. So it was a long project, and you know, I was very lucky in the sense that it's an expensive thing to do, really, to spend about like 20 days in Humla and then go around Kailas and come back to Kathmandu. To fly to Nepalganj to Simikot, and then you walk to Hilsa, and then you get into Tibet. But
and it's not
so
something
I got
to can afford, right?
Hell no. Not if your books don't sell like mine. Uh,
I'm sure that's
yeah,
not true.
it is absolutely true. अहिलेसम्म पनि भ्यानिसिङ एक्ट 6 वर्ष अगाडि छापिएको अहिलेसम्म रोयल्टी आउन थालेको छैन.
Okay, guys, please go buy Prawin's book as soon as the lockdown is over. Please.
If it's available in Kathmandu, because I don't think
it's one of my favorites. Or somebody can you can
maybe if you're in India, Amazon, or maybe if you ask QC nicely, maybe they will order it. Yes, Pranav is QC. Online. So yeah, in any case, yeah. So these other people, like the people I named, the Pasangyanji, Sagarji, Imani, Kisangchimi in Tibet, and then Shital like helping out. These are the people who actually collected the stories, and so there are a couple of stories in both books which I collected also because I got to travel to the region. I did my Kailash Kora the Pompo way, Bampanti. Muna is teasing me there. So I went anti-clockwise when I did the Kora. There was an extra day remaining in which we got up to some mischief, which was we traveled to a monastery,
that mean? Tell us
which was nice.
More about that.
Means he wasn't in the itinerary, but we sort of snuck off and went to see one of the older monasteries there. It was beautiful. Tibet is the Humla also like heartbreakingly beautiful. It just seems so fertile and so rich in terms of the landscape. The landscape has everything except it's so far away from the center that nothing gets there. Otherwise, like it's difficult to understand why people there still have to suffer poverty, because the land is rich. The soil is dark, rich, very fertile. Everything is there except the states.
All right. So Pravin was going to do some reading for us.
Am I? All right. Okay. So I'm going to read from a story called Mortal Gods. That's what I wanted to call the book initially, but then people didn't like it. I guess they didn't like the contradiction. Right. Okay. This is going to be strange. All right. This story was collected from Sirkha, I think. So this story was published by Gokul Singh Tatwal in Himalayan Dipti, a journal, on 28th September 1987. And it was found and translated by Himani. And then I retold it. I think I should talk about what retelling means. So I know, right? Like, Mortal Gods would have been a better title, but yeah. So when Himani translated this from the Hindi, from the magazine. Then it was probably about like 400 words long, and in the retelling, it's about 1,600 words, I think. Um, well, yeah. When I make it my own, I suppose that's the retelling. But I think we'll get to it later in our conversation. So
Yeah, I'd like to talk to you about that as well. Like what really goes into retelling and how much of yourself are you putting into the story when you're retelling. But let's do that after you've done the reading.
So there are some stories here.
In your
that,
radio voice, like Pranab said.
Oh, my radio voice. Oh,
Mm-hmm.
I'll try. I mean, can't guarantee anything. Okay. There's some other stories here where, demons eat little children, and I really enjoyed writing that because I knew that it would scare some kids.
Mm-hmm.
But this one's like sort of subversive in a slightly different way. This is page 21 in the English Nepali version. Lord Ranglin had built a pleasure palace for his daughters. From there, the sisters could see the Saipal mountain to the northeast and the Mahakali that flowed in the valley beneath it. There, the gods and the young women played chess on beds covered with red velvet and danced barefoot on soft grass and spent the entire night laughing and talking. The gods played flutes and drums while the young women danced. When the sisters asked, the gods happily danced for the young women. Pipihya and his brothers always made excuse to avoid eating any food that was offered to them, and they left the pleasure palace before sunrise. After a few days of blissful friendship, the sisters noticed that all the food they laid out for their guests was left untouched. From their stature and beauty, it is clear that these brothers are gods. Maybe they think our food is impure, the sisters said. They decided to peel with their own hands every grain of rice and to make rice pudding themselves. They wondered, what kind of a friend would refuse to eat something made with so much affection? The sisters spent the entire day peeling rice grains. They sang to chase away the boredom of the work. But they were also happy because they knew the pudding would make the gods smile. After boiling the pure rice in pure milk with the finest spices from Kerala and Kashmir, the sisters prepared five big bowls of kheer, milk and rice pudding. The gods arrived in the evening. The sisters asked them to sit on rugs made of the finest wools, fan them with yak tails, and put bowls of pudding before them. With a wink and a nod, the oldest of the brothers signaled to the others to pretend to eat the pudding, but never let a single grain of rice into their mouths. This was a strict rule that separated the pure gods from the impure humans. To break this rule was to defy creation itself. His brothers understood the signal, so they laughed and praised the pudding. "Oh, the cardamom smells beautiful," one said. "Surely the fragrance of saffron is more enticing," another added. The gods pretended to take the pudding to their lips, but cleverly threw it over their shoulders. But as he was loudly laughing and praising the pudding, a grain of rice went into Pipihya's mouth. As the night passed, the gods and sisters whispered secrets to each other and danced with arms around each other's waists. They tested who could resist the tickle of a peacock feather the longest. They played games of the mind and of the body until the goddess of dawn painted the eastern skies red. The gods promised to return in the evening, gently peeled away from the embrace of the sisters, and mounted their chariots. This is all that I've selected for today.
If it's original.
Mm,
I think that takes us back to
this version is original.
Retelling.
So this is the version that Imani had translated it. This story is about the ancient times when gods used to live in the forms of humans and even interacted and lived among them. One of the Devtas had 5 sons, out of which the youngest was called Pipihya, meaning one who had 4 elder brothers. This stuff is there actually, sorry. No, I'll just get to the part where it actually deals with the stuff that I read. At nights, the 5 brothers would go to the Milan Griha of the daughters of the Runglin Dev. Coincidentally, the Ruglin Dev had 5 daughters. The 5 brothers would spend their nights in the company of 5 sisters, where all would sing, dance, and make merry. Early in the mornings, the brothers would fly back in their chariots. The brothers were always careful to not consume any food or drink served to them by anyone. The sisters were aware that the 5 brothers did not eat anything served to them, but eager to serve their guests, they consulted each other and decided that they would make themselves peel the dhan with their own nails to make pure rice kheer for them. Thus, they prepared 5 manas of kheer for the brothers and served it to them affectionately on their next visit. Finding it difficult to refuse the polite offer, the brothers pretended to eat the kheer while actually throwing it away surreptitiously past their shoulder. While they were doing so, however, one piece of kheer accidentally entered into the mouth of the youngest brother Pipiya and escaped everyone's notice. When the brothers were flying out of the Miran Griha next morning, unexpectedly the chariot of the youngest brother started to descend and landed near Sita. So this is the part which corresponds to the part that I just read, right? So the difference is in the details. It's going to make sense. You know, all the like playing chess on a bed of red velvet and then tickling each other with peacock feathers and spices from Kerala and Kashmir and that kind of stuff. I suppose like I don't. I could have chosen a different section of the story to read this better. But yeah,
if I may just come in here,
please.
like the way I felt about this, like when I was reading through the different versions of the stories, I felt like in the versions that you had retold, you had clearly injected your poetry in it, or so I felt as a reader, and I felt like it just makes the stories more interesting as a read, and it's also more lyrical when you're reading it. It's no longer just a story about justice or about morality. It's also poetic, and I suppose others who've read you or have given you feedback have also said this. But how do you, as a writer, feel like you influenced, or did you influence it in any way when you were retelling the stories? What's your take on it?
Okay, let me backtrack a little bit. I wasn't supposed to write any of the stories in this book or in the other book, the Shared Sacred Landscape one. But when I expressed interest, Ashok Bhai welcomed the idea. In the other book, which is also available on the EC Mode website, there are like 7 stories in the book, 4 of them written by Kamlaji and 3 by me. Those stories are oriented towards a more mature readership, older people. But this, like, I wanted to write for younger readers. Specifically, I had Soumya Dhakal in mind when I was writing them. I think she was around 11 then. So I was writing for 10-year-old, 11-year-old readers, and I also wanted to have fun writing them. That's why what you're calling.
Did she get a chance to read it?
Yes, she read it before it got published. I mean, she doesn't speak much to me. She just like nods her head, but she nodded that she liked it.
Okay.
So, but what you're calling poetry, I think, is just me having fun. Just like bringing in sort of a soft touch, so that people reading it are intrigued. Or I don't think I've been moralistic anywhere. Like I don't think stories are preachy, except if we had to add some bits to make it sound spiritual, kind of. But otherwise, it's just me having fun telling the stories.
And do you think that's the idea behind folklore? Because I suppose as the stories are being passed on from one person to another, everyone does inject his or her idea of storytelling in it, right? So do you think you were just taking that idea forward or that practice forward? Or do you think by, I don't know, writing stories that, as you said earlier, don't really belong to you, right? Do you think, I don't know, do you think you've changed them, influenced them in any way?
Oh, this is what we were talking about yesterday, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was preparing like what I would say about what the function of folk tales or folklore is, and honestly, the only thing I could think of was it's probably designed to shut children up just before bedtime. I think it's to
Mm-hmm.
like I don't think there's a higher function as such to folk tales, except like
Mm-hmm.
maybe get the kids to like sit down and be quiet for a little bit, so that when the grandmother or the grandfather is telling the stories to the kids, then the mother and the father can be like, you know, elsewhere, sort of breathing in relief for a little bit. After that, maybe it teaches young people ideas about their cosmology, looking up at the stars and being like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
that star is this thing, that star is over there for that reason, that constellation, used to be this in a past life and is now this, so on and so forth. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so acquaint them with the stars and then maybe like teach them which fruit you can eat and which fruit will kill you, because these are the details that get like worked into stories, right? Okay, stories about the landscape, stories about your heritage, where things come from, where things are headed. Um, I think, but I think primarily it's to get like people to shut up and listen for a little bit. Um, the idea of telling other people's stories, that's a very complex one, I think. These are folk tales, right? Like if you download the PDF, um, you'll find that we've given credit to everybody, people who first like
Mm-hmm.
told the folktale, because a folktale by definition is not original, right? It's always like inherited, found, or encountered.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we have tried to credit everybody. Um, uh, but so if we think of a story like Put Ourselves On, which is the last story in the collection, which comes from a small village to the north of Kailas, I think, or the PPI story, which is like near the Nepal-India border. These aren't like sophisticated.
So, Praveen, I was just wondering, because I've been for the past few days, I've been asking you so many questions and reading these stories. I was just wondering, like, how is it different for you as a writer to be retelling these tales, as opposed to how you've written original stories?
Um, I had more fun with this book, retelling this story, uh, than how much work it is to write original stories. Because in some ways, like you get you get the characters, you get the setting, and then you get to have fun with just the mechanics of it. Um, but there's also a bigger burden that comes along. Writing original stories is more difficult. Um, I think also because I was writing for a younger readership, I could sort of be telling the kind of like jokes that my friends wouldn't find funny, but a child might, like that kind of like dad joke kind of stuff, or just like how it's fun to uh, scare little children and then again get them to laugh.
Hmm. So this is just something I was thinking about this morning. I think so many of us grew up with folk tales in our households, right? Told by, I don't know, relatives, grandparents, like you said. What were some of the stories in your childhood, Praveen?
There were two different kinds, I think. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I started reading when I was fairly young for a Nepali town, Nepali village. So those stories,
What does that
uh,
mean? You started reading for.
reading when I was quite young compared to other. I had reading material at home, which a lot of other people
Okay.
didn't.
Mm-mm.
In the village.
Mm.
And among the first things I read was, Mahabharata and Shukasagar. They were in Hindi, but
Mm.
I learned like because I could read Devanagari, like not deeply. So when I was like 8, 9 years old, I was reading Mahabharata and Sugasagar in Hindi. So I was reading stories from those sources. Sugasagar is mostly a retelling of the Mahabharata itself, but with other stuff thrown in. Mahabharata is already a pretty big story by itself.
Yeah.
But then these aren't folk tales, right? I mean, they probably were 2,000 years ago when they were written down.
Until they were
And
documented,
since
yeah.
then, since then they have not been folk tales. In India, they're authentic history, but in Nepal, we didn't have to call them that. But then there were the other stories, which I think like children also tell each other, like older siblings or cousins tell younger kids this. And I think everybody knows the story about the husband and wife who are visited by bears, and then the wife farts, and then the bear gets scared
No,
and runs away.
no, I don't
Uh,
know.
they're like
I don't.
naughty
Does
stories like
anyone
that.
here know that story? I don't know that one. But
Yeah,
so
it
I was talking
involves like
about this, I think.
somebody like pooping in the shape of a celebrity and then feeding it to the bears and stuff like that.
I don't think I
You know,
know that story. Does anybody here know the story? You can just send me a message here if you do. So I was asking my siblings this morning about the stories they know, folk stories, and I think the only story that really comes to my mind in terms of what I was being told as a child was the story about these two sisters, and there's this one sister who is a really good girl, and the other sister is not so good, and then eventually, so there are rewards and punishments, right? And then you grew up being taught. I mean, the influence of these stories are you're basically being told, "Don't chole bahan," right, Yukta? And so you're basically being told that you have to be good, and then there's reward if you're good, right? So, do you think folk tales have been replaced in the digital age?
it's not that folk tales have been replaced as much as the narrator has been replaced. Um, Kids are still consuming stories, but it can be like Peppa Pig now for somebody in Jamshedpur. You know what I mean? Um,
Yeah.
and, a, and I think our generation has failed to become the bridge also between the generation before us and the generation after.
Mm.
Um, I mean, I don't have any children, but when I go to visit my little like nephew, or say when I go to visit my friends' kids, I don't have enough like folk tales to tell the children either. You know, we should have had the one that you just like mentioned earlier. Have you told that story to Luniva's child?
No, no. Actually, interestingly, the first time he heard a Newari story was when Yukta came to our house last year with the book about the kya. And
Daplakya.
it was the first time, Dablankya, and it was the first Newari story, folk story that he was actually introduced to. And thanks to Yukta, that was his first story. And then the next morning, apparently, he went up to Yukta and said, "I'm Lakamari," because he confused Lakamari with Kya. So it's funny, but it's also sad that he came to it quite late. And I
Yeah.
don't think we've told him any other stories.
Sure.
So, do you want to answer Itisha's question? Can you tell us a little about the different oral traditions you encountered while collecting those folk tales? Thank you, Itisha, for that
Different
question, because
oral
that's something I've
traditions.
been meaning to ask him as well.
Different oral traditions, Rebecca. Okay, I think Itisha
Mm.
missed the initial bit when I was talking about different other people who went and they collected things, right? So if you download the PDF, at the very end of the book, you find the credits for who actually collected these. I got to talk to a few dhamis. I only got to talk to women in Tehe and Chipra, where I had to go out of my way to sort of ask the men to give me permission to talk to their wives, um,
Mm.
and or like not interrupt while I was talking to the older ladies. I had to sort of pretend to be collecting songs in order for me to work my way towards stories also. But mostly I talked with dhamis. So in the two books, there are stories about dhamis that I collected myself. Otherwise, like, no, I didn't have the chance to actually. In Tibet, like, we weren't allowed to speak to anyone. We had an army escort. Tibet. Not that it was impossible. We got to talk to some like Nepalis who ran momo shops there. Otherwise, like, it was just impossible to talk to. But yeah, but I think like Itisha, if you look at the credits, you'll see that uh, there are many different kinds of sources. Um, so, for instance, Imani has collected stuff from a magazine that's published every 2 years by a society of people who meet every 2 years because there's only like a few thousand of them, so they have a mela every 2 years, I think, and then they bring out a commemorative book where people tell these stories. Arco in Tibet, Chimila went to elders and asked them for stories. So for me, not traditions as such, but like okay. So for instance, if you think of Humla, and so there is Karnali that comes through Hilsa all the way to Chipra, and then there's another like tributary to Karnali that comes from the east below Rolingomba and Barkhan, and it meets at Chipra. So there is a place around Kholsi, below that bit where you find fish in the river. People can grow rice also. There, among the Khas, the villains, Ratchasar, they have jad or like bote characteristics. But then in the east, in the Barkhang area, the older stories have ogres and like demons for the villains, right? So, so you can draw a line along like what's almost like a racial divide, and find people calling each other the bad guy and saying across those rivers. Yeah. So oral traditions that demarcate between the languages and religions, races. Not
So probably
race.
you were you're talking about how, if I may interrupt you, you're talking about how you didn't really get a chance to speak to women in the region when you're collecting these stories, eh? How do you think women have been portrayed in folk tales, and what do you think it says about our society, especially in the region, if you talk about these three countries? Because there are goddesses in the stories, right?
Yeah.
And there are female
I think
characters who display who display a lot of wisdom
I
and
think you were
patience,
talking
and
about this
again,
yesterday also. Yesterday also.
yeah, you didn't respond to it, but yeah.
Well, I started typing it and then I realized I was wrong. I was going to say like, well, goddesses don't menstruate, but that's not true.
Goddesses
Then I
don't
thought about
menstruate, is that true?
no. See, I was about to write that to you because I think that would be what somebody in the Humla area would tell you. But in
Okay.
in the Shakta tradition, that isn't true. It wouldn't be true in the Tantric tradition also, right? Um, Sati
May
Devi
not be true.
probably like menstruated. So halfway through my answer, I was like, maybe that's not like
I think
universally
all
true. So,
women would menstruate, right? It's
but that's the point. No, our goddess is women. Is the question. The whole like denying their womanhood is important in some ways to call somebody goddess also sometimes, right?
You mean because
That's
they've
why like
also been given these male attributes? Like they've been assigned roles
no,
where
as long as they are,
they have
as
like
long
the
as they don't
traditionally
menstruate,
male.
as long as they don't menstruate, they get to be goddesses. And the moment they do, they don't, like in the Kumari tradition, right? So I don't know, like, uh, but 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 because like it's funny. Should I like talk about what I was telling you about the goddesses being
Yeah.
brought to the villages?
Yes,
So
please go.
um, uh, I met a Dhami, Man Bahadur Sai in Khulsi, who is the Dhami of Bhavani. And then I also met Dabbale Pariyar in Tehe, who is the Dhami of Harki or Sarki. So in the stories that they told about their like god and goddess, what was common was these deities had been brought to the village by a young woman whose fathers, by young women in both cases, whose fathers had been dhamis in their respective villages a few days away, right? And when they were married off, one to Kolsi, one to Tehe, their fathers gave them the gods, a god and a goddess, so that they could protect the daughter. You know? So in case of Tappale Pariyar's family, apparently, and then I think like we have to be careful when we, I have to be careful when I say like that they told me that the god was brought there 6 generations ago. When it was probably more than that. It's probably longer than that. You know? कोही मेरो मेरो हजुरआमाको पालामा भन्छ अनि कति पुस्ता अगाडि भन्यो भने 8 पुस्ता टाइप्स. Both of their like ancestor grandmothers, भनौँ न अजी माउहरू, they brought, hi, you're back. So they were given the gods in dowry types, and then they brought them over to their village. And in Akase, sorry, Dabbale Pariyar's case, the first Dhami was a 1-year-old child, Akase Pariyar, whereas in Manba Desai's case, the goddess first possessed his ancestor grandmother, like a mother in his patrilineal ancestor side, and then it passed on to the sons.
So looking at these stories, it almost seems like humans and gods are at war because they inhabit each other. They are fighting each other. They're constantly talking to each other, right? What do you think that says about our history of society, especially given that these stories are from this region that covers these 3 countries that you talked about in the beginning of this conversation?
What does it say about our society?
Yeah, so are we at par with the gods, or?
See, like, I came away sort of unhappy from Humla. I mean, the landscape is beautiful, everything, but the culture, man, it's difficult, you know, like, the cost culture is like extremely difficult to sort of square with. Over and over again, what the Dhamis like either emphatically or with regret repeated was that the gods get most angry when women don't follow menstrual like purity rules, or when upper caste people mingle with lower caste people.
Yeah, that comes up repeatedly in the stories.
And I was just saying, like, what do you do with that? Like, what's the point in sort of? I can't glorify that part of their belief system. So, and also there were two particular like instances that sort of made me question the whole Dhami idea. I don't know if I should be talking about this. So in Chipra, the Dhami for Lohasur, and Lohasur isn't among the 12 main gods. He's a demigod, as his name indicates. Like there's Asur in his name, right? Female Dhamis, I'll come back to that. Okay, I'll answer that part. So this man who was about 84 years old, I think at that time, one of the most powerful Dhamis in the region, had been the equivalent of a Gavisa Sachi when he was young, the headmaster of the only high school around after that, retired from these 2 positions, and then become a Dhami, right? In some ways, it only like climbed up the hierarchy of power that you can like enjoy in that region, right? There was another story of another village, I think a Bone village, but also there are shamans. But that shaman used to be the only policeman. They had been like the only sort of like police or representatives of the state in that region since the Rana times, sort of like inherited the position of power. And then when he gets nice and old, like in his mid-60s or something, then he becomes a dhami, a god. You know what I mean? These men became
So you're already in a
gods.
powerful position, and then you
The
just
most
find
powerful
another
people.
way to
Yeah,
consolidate power.
that's one type. The other type, people like Man Bahadur Shahi, and this will connect with Suv's question about female dhamis also. Man Bahadur Shahi is Bhavani's dhami. He is a goddess's dhami, right? He did not want to be a dhami. He quite literally cried before my eyes, saying like, "This is the biggest curse I've been given," because he can't work. He has no son. He has like 5 daughters, and he's like, "It must be because I'm dhami to a goddess. I have all these daughters, but I have no son. And without a son, in that particular, in that world, uh, his self-worth it's probably deprecates because he has no son. He's not allowed to do any physical work, so he can't earn a living. And he was like, I was desperate not to be a dhami, and I ran away from home to avoid being a dhami. But wherever I went, the goddess would possess me. So I had to come back to my village. And also because the villagers put a lot of pressure on him, saying like, we need to worship. Like, it doesn't matter if you choose to be the dhami or not. We need to talk to the gods, and you are the one who can do it. You better come back for us. You know what I mean? So he had no choice about it.
The chosen one.
So yeah. So some people choose to become gods, and some people are chosen. Some have like greatness thirst upon them. So thrust upon them. Coming back to what Sue was asking about female dhamis. Man Bahadur Shah's ancestor, one of the grandmothers, like back when, 6-7 generations ago, had brought Bhavani with her and was possessed by Bhavani. So she was the dhami. But then after that, Bhavani started possessing the sons in the family. It didn't go to the daughters, and the sons, right?
So again, the will of the
but
gods.
there are, is it?
I mean, or that's how it is put, right?
Not,
so it's the will of the God to
in this particular
choose
case,
a vessel which is again male and not female. I mean, that's the justification.
in this particular case, there are also women who get possessed by goddesses or other local spirits. There are women in all like caste or across the caste system in different like castes, women who do get like this. At least they're lucky not to be called witches in that context, and we call goddesses, I think. But there are women who get possessed, but they don't get to be called families. They don't exercise the same level of power.
And again, the moment you call somebody a witch, then
by a male god, like I don't think
right?
so. Sorry. I'm answering. I don't think a male god, or among the 12 gods, I don't think they possess.
And again, that's really strategic, and I think that's why when we were talking about this yesterday, you said you're very, very interested in these stories about. There is so much in it, right? And there's so much strategy, and there's so much.
Well, yes, but
that goes
that's
into
their life.
That shapes.
Sorry, Itisha is asking a question. Myths, folktales, and fairy tales. I don't think we have as many fairy tales. I think our myths are driven by religion, different religious traditions. And I think the folk tales are the kind that Muna will never look at a celebrity again in the same way. I think his name is Lok Bikram Adhikari or Kallan Bikram Lok. Bodh Bikram Adhikari, I think, is a writer who has collected a lot of folk tales. Tulsi Divas has collected a lot of folk tales across Nepal. Kesarlal Yes. Kesarlal has translated a lot of folk tales. I think those are the folk tales.
Kesar
But I
Lal
don't think we have
Sesha.
fairy tales as such. Yes. I don't think we have fairy tales as
So,
such
so John here said
because
maybe
we have
witches
gods.
were ancient chemists.
Maybe witches and alchemists, maybe. Yeah.
I think witches might have been a lot of things until they were defined as they have been defined now in our society.
Well, it's the patriarchy.
I think that could, I think we could have another conversation around that. That'll span to at least.
I don't know much about witches.
We can keep that for later. So I will ask you a question, Pavi. I think the stories changed slightly when you retold them from the different versions I read. I mean, there are some major changes also, not in terms of what the stories are saying, but in terms of the descriptions, right? In terms of the emotions you put in it and all of that. So do you think these stories will keep changing, and how do you think those influences will also impact these different regions where the stories are being
The
told?
plot, I didn't change the plot of the stories. But the
But then
telling
you
can
injected
change,
other
right?
elements.
I had taken with me my Kindle, into which I'd put Italo Calvin's folk tales and the Grimm Brothers stories. And especially Calvino shows the variances, regional variances, and like how, I forget like which ones, but he even talks about how like in parts of Italy there were princely, princely states or like dukedoms versus there were more like democratic setups. And folk tales, the same story changes between these two places. And what he was showing was, if I remember correctly, in places where there were hereditary like rulers, like dukedoms and uh, princely states, when somebody came to the court, the king would always ask everybody around for their opinion. But in places that were like Florence, where a bunch of like seniors would like a council of seniors would sort of run the city affairs, there the folktales had more autocratic rulers would get their comeuppance eventually. So I was like looking at these things, and so when I retold the stories, I had my biases. With this story about Harki coming to Tehe, I wanted to remind people that this is the story. This is a story from the Pariyars, and not necessarily Shais and Thakuris, right? When I retold the Gorkhali Pitre story, fighting the Gorkhalis, I wanted to make the Gorkhalis seem dumb, which, as somebody from Tano, I think Gorkhalis are. Um, that's the bias we have, at least. Cruel, and like people who are only focused on like narrow gains, and people who don't get beauty. That's what we think of Gorkhali. In any case,
and you do.
so I wanted.
I think you do that in your story. I think
Yeah.
you do portray them as dumb in the story. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the Gorkha Empire has ruled for the last 250 years. Matzale, somebody has to thumb their noses at them a little bit. Or some or a story like, I think there's a story from the bone tradition here, which most people like aren't very aware of the bone tradition in Nepal and Tibet, how old it is. Buddhists will always say that Bon is a new religion, like what only in like last 700 years or so. Bon will say like it's older than. What kind of values do you think folktales will hold in the future?
Yeah.
values. I don't understand the value aspect of this. Do we mean like more cultural values, or do we mean the worth of the folk tales? I think stories will always have worth. Um, there are stories that have been transcribed from cuneiform or from like the Egyptian hieroglyphics, which are just as fun to read now. They must have been fun to write down back then, like 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Uh, one of the oldest themes I think people find in writing is fathers complaining about their sons being lazy, for instance. Um, young women like spending too much time before a mirror. This kind of stuff like goes back like thousands of years. Or sons like spending too much time with the barber, I think, is an old trope. Uh, so stories will last. People will want stories, but what will they mean to us? No? I was thinking about Corona uh, earlier. For instance, in this valley where we live, there are temples dedicated to certain goddesses who are also epidemics, right? Sitala Devi, even as there are goddesses that people would worship in order to ward off an epidemic, or if an epidemic did arrive.
Okay, this is new to me. I wasn't aware of this.
Like temple to Corona anytime soon, right?
I hope not.
COVID Devi ko puja to hudaina hola. But earlier, people of this valley used to worship like.
I think Mahankal, right? Like the death of God. That's who you
God
go
of death.
to. I know.
Yama.
Sorry.
God
of death. Yeah.
I think there are different shrines or different goddesses. What I'm saying, like, if you were to build a temple to Corona, you would need a story to go with it. And the story would probably be like, in the time of the Rashtrapati Vidya Devi Bhandari, there was a Mahamari, and then somebody from Patan had a dream, and then did this and that, and then Corona Devi was happy and went back to China. And that would become a folk tale, right? But I don't think that's going to happen now. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I think also going back to what John's question on the future of story, I was just thinking maybe the nature of how stories are being told is changing, and I guess that's the future, right? It's probably not going to be told the way they were told in the past, but then that tradition still continues. I think just the form keeps changing, the medium.
Yeah.
I know. I
don't know. Maybe things will change. Maybe because you don't have to rely upon an elder to tell you the difference between two berries anymore, except the elder named Google Kaka. Why would we tell? Storytelling is like outsourced, right? I was mentioning Peppa Pig earlier. Like, children would learn phrases from you. Children would learn like how to describe something from you by listening to stories. But now there was an article about how like kids in the American South, like young children in American South, have a British accent because they've been watching too much the Peppa Pig. So like I don't know, your technology he was kind of I don't know. I think things will change. Plus, our generation has like seen these like massive changes in this regard. But technology, how intrusive technology is.
Yeah. I mean, I gladly see that for my generation, but for people like my nephew, like he's already Netflixing, and I think it's already changed the way he is viewing stories, because he can also choose what stories he wants to watch or listen to instead of waiting for an elder to tell him a story, right? So access also changes the way we understand stories and the way we seek stories.
I mean, it's a good thing. So I think what we can do is, again, circling back to Durga sister books or this book, we can make more available for young kids to like choose. about, like Kaji Studio, they make games that are based on this area, this culture, this part of the world, right? Similarly, so there are ways that I think we have to be more active in producing the content that we want our children to access, I suppose. I don't know.
And I think there's a huge, I think there's a lot of demand for Nepali stories or Nepali content for children, because our children are watching a lot of foreign stuff. Nepalमा छँदै छैन, एकदम थोरै छ, I mean, and it's good to see that there's a lot of stuff coming up now, and I think there's definitely demand for more. So yeah. So on that note, I think Pravin, we're going to close this conversation. If there's anything you want to say that you didn't get a chance to say earlier, now's your chance.
Download the book, read it, I suppose, if you haven't already. Also, I think is a perfect time when you're home with your family to collect stories. When I last met my grandfather, I asked him, like, हाम्रो घर अहिले जहाँ छ अब खैरीमा त्यो ठाउँको नाम के हो, right? And then he was like, because even he had to work backwards. It took me like, no, that's not the real name. No, that's not the real name. Because if I know the name, it's probably not the real name. And eventually, I got him to tell me the name of that place, which he hadn't heard as a child. That specific location. Okay? So it took me like, I had to peel back 4 different like names before we could get to that name. So do that with your elders. Ask them stories that they remember, that they might have forgotten that they remember. Like prod them a little bit. I think.
Yeah.
And then save it for Looney Basket.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. I do that. I talk to my father and my mother a lot about old Kathmandu, because I feel like they're my sources of information on what Kathmandu used to be like. And sometimes when I'm writing these essays about Kathmandu, I'm completely depending on their memory of it, and I feel like if I don't write them now, who else will? Because they will be forgotten, and they're not going to write them down. So,
Yeah, place names also like really important. Of course, there's the whole Kepi Mallako essay, like people keep turning to. So outside Kathmandu also, place names are disappearing. When place names disappear, like really interesting concepts also disappear in the language, and stories like tied to that. Yeah. Road building ले अहिले चौताराहरू भत्काइरहेको छ माथि गाउँ-गाउँमा, हैन? With that, like a family's history disappears. Things like that. Like, so finding out more, recording them, keeping a record of like what we don't know.
Yeah, and so let's close with that. Yeah. Thank you, Pravin, for your time. I realized, guys, that it's been a long conversation, and the lighting has started changing. And because I definitely had to find a new corner because of poor connection. But this has been really encouraging. We still have 25 people watching this, and I was
thank you, everybody,
in the beginning, and this has been great. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, this has been fun.
And thank you, Pravin, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Prateebha, for doing this, and I hope you do this. We'll do more of these with other writers also. Thank you. Bye.